I believe that entrepreneurs continue the work of creation. I don't necessarily care if your creation story involves 6 days in a garden and a day of rest, that's cool, or an explosion out of nothingness from 13.7 billion years ago, that's good. But the work of creation is continued on by entrepreneurs. Entrepreneur is a French word that translates terribly into English as undertaker. So I prefer to think of it as risk taker. Profits really come from risk, right? Without risk, there would be no profit. If you think about it, the interest rate is really the rate of return on no risk. If you want to earn 2 or 3%, just take all of your money and put it in government bonds and be done. No risk, and you'll earn 2 to 3% profit. But if you want to be profitable, if you want to be beyond that, you've got to take a risk. And that's what entrepreneurs do. They think that they can take their money, invest it somewhere else in their business, and earn profit beyond the 2 to 3% that you would get in government bonds. Now, what's interesting is that oftentimes organizations seem to be risk averse, which is bizarre, right? Because if profits come from risk, but they are then risk averse, well, why did they bother? And I got into this concept of thinking about strategy. By the way, I should introduce myself at this point. My name is Ed Kless. I'm with Sage in North America. You can tell by the accent already. You've got that figured out, I'm sure. And my role with Sage for the past 14 years has really been working with business partners, accountants, bookkeepers, and even customers in helping them make their business better. I like to think of it as having the best job at Sage. It's not the highest profile, but it's the best because of what I believe, that entrepreneurs continue the work of creation. I get to do one job, and I get 3 times the benefit. I help Sage customers, I help Sage partners, accountants, and I also theoretically at least help Sage. And I'm thinking that's true because they've kept me around for 14 years, so must be doing at least something. So I do one job and I benefit 3 constituencies. And one of the areas where I've done an awful lot of work is strategy in small organizations, developing strategy. And that's what I want to share a bit with you this morning, about this notion of strategy in small organizations. Whether it's a firm or whether it's just a manufacturer, it doesn't matter. I'm going to approach this from a generic standpoint. So, well, let's jump in. Don't turn that way. That's just the mental note I made. Don't turn that way, because that causes you guys to lose your ears. I want to share with you a pretty interesting concept that was first shared with me about 14 years ago by a guy by the name of Peter Block, B-L-O-C-K. Peter Block's written a ton of books. Most of them, they're in the business section, but they're really more about philosophy than anything else, is the way that I look at it. And this is honestly one of the 2 or 3 most important things that I've ever learned. And that is that this concept of asking better questions inside organizations. Block says that there are actually only 6 questions that organizations usually struggle with. And they're over here on the right-hand side of your screen, these how-based questions. How do you do it? How long will it take? How does it cost? How do you get those people to change? How do you measure it? How have other people done it successfully? Now, what changes is the it, right? The it changes from person to person, from organization to organization, from industry to industry. But the form of the question remains the same. It's all these, how are we going to do this? How are we going to do this? How are we going to do this? Right? And Block says, look, these are important questions. These are all practical questions. But he says the problem is that they are often asked too early in the process. And what these questions tend to do when asked too early is they block change from happening. These are eminently practical questions. You seem like a genius if you ask these questions in meetings. Oh yeah, how are you going to measure that? Right? Oh yeah, how have other people done this successfully? The problem is that those questions, again, inhibit innovation and change from happening in small organizations. Especially that one, how have other people done it successfully? Think about that. If you have to answer that question, you cannot have innovation, right? You can't have something new, because if other people have done it successfully, it wouldn't be innovative to begin with. Yet that question is very often asked in meetings. Oh yeah, how's this going to work? How have other people have done this successfully? Think about it if I'll use an American example here, but think about the Wright brothers. Think if they had asked this question on their way from Dayton, Ohio to Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. So Wilbur, how has this powered man flight thing worked before? Well, Orville, I've been thinking about it, and I did some research at the library, and there's this guy Icarus and Daedalus. Remember the guy with the wax and the wings? And that didn't work so well. And perhaps the greatest human mind ever to exist, Leonardo da Vinci, built no less than 4 flying machines, none of which got off the ground. Well, one of them does, the heliocopter, but it really kind of hops for a while and then destroys itself in the process. Oh, you're right, Wilbur, the hell with it. Let's just go back to the bicycle shop. Right? So if we get stuck in these questions of how is this going to work, these how-based questions, we often lose sight of the fact that we want to do something differently, perhaps it's never been done before. And that's certainly the strategy. One of the aspects of strategy is we think that our strategy is going to be different. It's not going to be the same, and we'll talk more about this as we get through the process here. Okay, I want to share with you when I first encountered this notion of strategic thinking. And it was in this book, probably the most famous bestseller in business history, right? Tom Peters and Robert Waterman, In Search of Excellence. This is an actual picture of the copy that I stole from my dad when I was in college, and read it cover to cover when I was taking some business classes. And on page 10 of this book is this little thing called the 7S model. Some of you who went to B school have probably seen this before, but it's a really interesting model. What Peters and Waterman said is that what this model is these are 7 different ways that we can look at an organization. Think about it like the bottom of a microscope in biology class, and when you turn the microscope, you get different powers of magnification, and you see different things when you look at it. That's what these things are intended to be, different perspectives on the organization. And they called theirs the 7S model the happy atom, it was called, because it looks like it revolves around the center here, this shared values. But what was interesting is they really had no order of precedence to these things. It really didn't matter which one you looked at first. And this is how they organized their book, by the way. In Search of Excellence was organized around these different S's and what they meant in different organizations. Well, about 20 years ago, I encountered someone who made a modification to this model that I think was extraordinarily important. And what he did was this, is he actually pulled out shared vision and strategy and move them to the left, right? Move them to the left of the chart. And what he said is now what we want to do is give some precedence to these things. So there's an order. Instead of them just being one thing in the center, there's actually an order of precedence. The first thing that we need to do in the organization is figure out what our shared vision is, right? Perhaps we would call this purpose. Right, and there's lots of different ways to describe this, and I'll talk briefly about it. I got a whole nother presentation just on shared vision, but we're going to talk about the strategy bubble today. But notice that strategy is the bridge, right? Strategy is after we figure out what our vision is, then we move into the implementation of that vision. And that's what we're going to talk about today. But just briefly, just to get everybody caught up, because I don't want to be too much, there's the expression of in medias res in literature, which dropped into the middle of things with no context. I want to give you a little context around shared vision before I talk into strategy, but don't worry, it was just one slide on it. And anybody know what this is? Yes? Red blood cells, exactly. This is a picture of red blood cells. Pretty interesting about what red blood cells are. This is why we live, right? We need red blood cells in order to be able to live. In fact, one of the definitions of death is inability to produce your own red blood cells, right? But none of us wake up every morning thinking, red blood cell production on my list of to-dos today, right? That's not what we do. We don't wake up. Now, the things that we do during the day are the things that produce red blood cells. We drink, we eat, we exercise, maybe. So different things that we do in order to ensure red blood cell production happening, but it's not our reason for getting up in the morning, right? Hopefully there are other reasons in your life other than red blood cell production that motivate you to get up. Well, a guy by the name of John Mackey, who is the CEO of Whole Foods, uses red blood cells as an analogy in business. And what he says is red blood cells are in our body is like profit in a business. They are a necessary condition for survival, right? Unless we produce a profit, we don't go on continuously living as a business. So it's the result. It's always the result, which should be the result. Peter Drucker said that profits, and I love this phrase, profits are the price we pay for tomorrow. I really like thinking of it that way. Profits are the price we pay for tomorrow. So profits are not evil in any way. It's just what we have to do in order to survive. But notice that no business should be getting up every morning thinking, we got to make a profit today. Just like red blood cells in your body. It's not when you wake up thinking, hey, we've got to produce a profit, right? There's got to be purpose. There's got to be meaning beyond that. And that's where we're gonna jump into this to strategy then, and understanding how strategy fits in. Strategy is the bridge between that purpose, the why do you do what you do, over to how are you going to implement it in your organization. Right? Now, just to share with you a second, I started out my presentation this morning telling you my purpose, telling you my why. Why am I here before you today? Why did I fly 4,500 miles from Dallas, Texas to come talk to you for an hour over here in London? And that is because I believe that entrepreneurs continue the work of creation. And everything else flows from that. I get up every single morning thinking, how can I help entrepreneurs in any way continue the work of creation? That's my purpose. The money that I earn from Sage, the paycheck that gets deposited in my bank every 2 weeks, is my profit, if I'm going to do a profit loss statement on myself, right? But it's not why I get up every morning. The why I get up is to help entrepreneurs. So what we're going to talk about today in detail now is this shift from purpose over to the implementation inside an organization, because we still do ultimately have to answer those practical questions on a regular basis. How are we going to do this? How have other people done this successfully? Those are still important questions. Remember, Block just said that the problem is they were asked too early in the process. So this presentation, if nothing else, is about asking questions, asking strategic questions. I made a little sub-process of mine, understanding how to ask better questions. There's an American philosopher named Eric Hoffer, who was a longshoreman in the port of San Francisco and studied philosophy, became a self-taught philosopher. And he said that questions are one of the things that separate us from other animals, our ability to ask questions. After all, answers can be given in grunts and gestures, but questions require our humanness. As far as we know, we're the only animal that asks a question. Your dog can indicate preference, right? If you're sitting there watching a movie, the dog will look at you, look at the popcorn, look at you, look at the popcorn, look at you, look at the popcorn. They're indicating preference, but they're not saying, hey, can I have some popcorn? Right? And as far as we know, we're the only species that allows us to ask questions. Hoffer goes on to say that societies suffer not from a lack of answers, but actually the inability to ask new and better questions. Yet there are no courses on question asking in most business schools. And today, this entire presentation is centered around asking some better questions around strategy, right? What are the questions that we can ask? So far, so good? Yes? Any questions from you to me at this point? Keep going. If you want to leave now, I'll just do this. It's okay if you're like, oh no, I wandered into this and this was not really where I want to be. I'm really not offended by it. It's okay. 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 All right, well, let's jump in. This is what most of the literature about strategy shows as our beliefs about strategy. If you read about strategic planning, this is what you're going to hear. In fact, they call it often strategic planning. You'll hear that strategy is about analyzing your situation. We need data. Data, data, data. Lots of data. I think data is a good thing. I'm, here work for Sage. We produce our systems, all of them produce lots of data. In case you didn't know that, right? Lots and lots of data. I think there's a problem though in modern business in that data is like a substance abuse problem. I see leaders and managers in organizations who are addicted to data. They get a little bit, it's like crack. They get a little bit and then they want more. And they want more and more and more. And before you know it, you have these, balanced scorecard dashboards that have 17 key performance indicators on them. Okay, if you got 17 key performance indicators, guess what? They're not key anymore. So by the end of this presentation, I'm going to share with you the three that I believe, the three key, and I actually will go so far as to say these are not performance indicators, but rather predictive indicators, right? To give you predictions of the future. Because after all, accounting, in the end, by definition, is about the past, right? We're accounting for it. It happened yesterday. So we have to look into the future, and how can we peer into the future? Okay, so these are the strategy beliefs. Analyzing your situation with lots of data, planning, lots and lots of planning. I think, especially among small businesses, there's this belief that strategy is somehow very mysterious and mystique. You need to really, in order to do proper strategic planning, you got to fly 3 people to Reykjavik, Iceland, and they have to lock themselves into a hot room for 3 days, and then they come out, and the strategic plan, will emerge from them sitting with this shamanic guy and a. This is I think what a lot of us think of, because it's very black box. Yes, so strategy. But I think it can be simpler than that. And then lastly, this is strategy. What are we going to do? Strategy is about what are we going to do? What are the things that we're going to do? And most businesses, when I encounter them, are like, yeah, okay, this makes total sense. This is the beliefs. This is what strategy is about. But I think there is a better way to think about this. I think there are strategic realities. The first one is that strategy is more creative than it is analytical. Strategy is about the future. It's about the future. It's not about the past. More on this in just a second. So it's more about creative. What are we going to do? Creativity. Than analyzing the situation. I'm not saying you don't analyze your situation at all. And by the way, I'm not saying that all data is bad. That's certainly not the case. Data can be a very useful tool. I just think that it can be overused. Strategy is execution. Strategy is execution, not just the plan, but actually execution. There needs to be a culture of execution to happen in order to make strategy work. I have worked with hundreds, perhaps thousands of organizations that have gone through the, quote, strategic planning process only to implement nothing. And they'll say to me, well, I guess the strategy didn't work. I said, well, how do you know? Well, it didn't work. Well, but you didn't do it, right? You didn't execute. So how do you know? How do you know if the plan was bad or not? You don't know, right? The other thing is too is that we must have a decent plan. There is no good way to implement a bad idea. Does that make sense? There's no good way to implement a bad idea. So we need to make sure that we have some of the right things in place first. And then lastly, and I think this one might be one of the key takeaways, I hope that you might take from this presentation, is that strategy, especially in small businesses, is about what are we going to say no to. It's a diet. Think about it as a diet, right? What are we going to say no to? Because this is the problem with, I mentioned entrepreneurs earlier today. Entrepreneurs like the shiny new thing, right? So a new thing comes in, oh yeah, let's do that. But the problem is that we really have to say, what are we going to say no to? Let me give you a quick example. By the way, I said in small businesses, the more and more I study this, the more and more I realize is that, no, it's also about large businesses should be focused on this too. Because I think that in larger organizations there's a problem. For example, Apple, you got to, by the way, that's a requirement. If you do a presentation, you have to give Apple as a reference. It's like, required. Apple in their stores has about 75 SKUs at any one time. 75, that's it. HP has roughly 15,000. SKUs. In fact, Steve Jobs even once said, "I'm most proud of what Apple hasn't done." So here's a guy who got this from in a large business context. In the end, this does get to a marketing function. Quick aside here, there's only, and I hate to simplify this if you're a marketing person, but there's only 2 marketing strategies. Only 2. We can figure out a way to be moderately appealing to a large group of people. That's strategy 1. That can be a good strategy. We want to be moderately appealing to a large group of people. Or we can be intensely appealing to a small group of people. That's it. That's the only 2 marketing strategies, right? And you got to think which is it that you want to be, right? Moderately appealing to a large group, intensely appealing to a short group. I kind of lean towards the second, intensely appealing to a smaller group of people. Why? Because I'm also a pricing guy, and if I'm intensely appealing to a small group of people, I can have higher prices, right? So strategy is about what are you going to say no to? What are you not going to do in the future? Okay? When I first started helping organizations do strategic planning, this is the question, or some variant of it, that we always started out with. I call this the MOASK. The MOASK, the mother of all strategic questions, right? Because every question after that came from this. And the question usually is how much revenue do we need to produce in some period in the future, whether that's 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, I don't care what your period, whatever period for the strategic plan is, this is usually the first question that's asked. Okay, this is the first question that's asked. And because we have data, we usually do something like this. We go back and we look at here's our current year, and we go fiscal year -1, 2, 3, 4. We take our revenue, right? And then we see, okay, here's our trend line. And then we put it into all kinds of statistical analysis, and we say we have a 98% chance of reaching in this category. We're going to be 98% confidence level that this is where the revenue is going to go. Okay, great. What's the worst that can happen? It can go down a little bit, but here's what we're looking for, right? And we're like, okay, yep. This was the first question. Let's start here. Here's the problem: is that using the past to predict the future turns out to be a pretty lousy way to predict the future, right? Let me share with you. This is very much akin to this graph. This is the days of life of a goose and the happiness of the goose. And you can see that on the day 1 here, the goose is fed. Everything's great. I get more and more food. Everything's fantastic. In fact, the goose probably thinks on day 1,000, this is my 98% confidence level that this is going to happen. But then Christmas rolls around, you see. There's a significant deviation from reality of what's happening. But this is the goose. If they were using strategic planning tools that we use in modern business, they'd be like 98% confidence level that things are going to get better, right? So it turns out this is a pretty lousy way to think about it. So instead, and apologies to and I'm not kidding, hundreds of organizations that I helped where I asked the first MOASK, this, I decided, is the real MOASK, the real mother of all strategic questions. This is the question that every strategic plan needs to begin with. And that is, how much value are we going to create in our future customers? And how are we going to do that? How are we going to create value in the future? That's the question that we need to ask. Because if you think about it, revenue is not a function of our costs and prices. Revenue is a function of the value that we create, right? And this needs to be the starting point for the conversation. What I found is that organizations who begin with this question think about external, what's going to happen outside of the organization, not inside. Those organizations that start with the revenue question, the conversation then quickly follows is, okay, how many leads do we need to create? right? And the focus becomes completely internal, inside the organization, about the things that we can, quote, control. Whereas that organizations start with this question, completely focused outside the organization. And they try to think about things from a future perspective. And they've been overall a lot more successful in starting with this question. The problem is that there's no data. There's no data to support all this. Because it's really about our hopes and dreams of the future. And there's no formula for that. Right? People want a formula though. Right? They want a formula. But I can't give it to them. And we can't give it to them. So we got to start at a different place. Does this make sense? Right? How do we look at outside, external, the organization? Because really, in the end, organizations are really paid to be effective, not efficient. Think about that. If you have a brain tumor, do you want an effective surgeon or an efficient one? Probably an effective one, I'm thinking. That would be the default value for me. I'll take the effective surgeon. Yet there seems to be in business a cult of efficiency. There's a cult of efficiency. We call them Lean Six Sigma Guru Ninja Turtle something. Apologies if there's anybody here who's Lean Six Sigma. But there's nothing wrong with it per se, except when it becomes the focus of the organization, that's when we have a problem, right? Because it becomes more about what's happening inside the organization rather than outside. It becomes more focused on efficiency and not effectiveness, right? And who cares if you're efficient at the wrong thing? And oftentimes I think organizations spend way too much time becoming efficient at stuff that their customers don't care about. Right? So that's the number one thing. Okay. This MOASC, this is the starting point. The beginning of the strategy conversation is this question, and we should struggle with it for quite some time. Okay. If you don't know this guy, I would really suggest you look him up and read his book, Uncommon Sense and Common Nonsense. Dr. Jules Garded, who's actually here at London Business School. And I love this quote. Strategy is the rare and precious skill of staying one step ahead of having to be efficient. Right? One step ahead of having to be efficient. If you're really good at strategy, efficiency doesn't matter. You don't need to be efficient because you're so focused on the outside that you're effective for customers. Now, this is not an exhortation for purposeful inefficiency. I, for one, like to take the least amount of steps when I'm unloading the dishwasher. So when I load the dishwasher, I pack it properly, right? So they get as much in, and then I can take all of the plates and go in one step. So I'm not saying, hey, be purposefully inefficient. What I am saying is that effectiveness, always and everywhere, trumps efficiency. And too often, strategic plans are about how are we going to eke out the last 20% of efficiency inside an organization. The most efficient organizations are the ones that ultimately go out of business completely. Like take the buggy whip manufacturers, right? I'm sure the last buggy whip manufacturer was the most efficient one, right? Because after all, it had outlived all of its competition. But it was unfortunately making the wrong thing, right? It was making the wrong thing. So efficiency, high levels of efficiency are a problem. In fact, as humans, we don't like complete efficiency. In fact, we want deliberate displays of waste in a lot of ways. This is why Shakespeare says in Caesar, he says, let me have men about me who are fat, right? Why? Because he wants people with long time horizons, not someone who's starving for their next meal, right? So that's why we don't like complete efficiency. We like to see demonstrated that you don't have to be efficient. Think about this. When you have a professional, like a dentist, let's say, you don't want your dentist operating at 100% efficiency. Why? Because that means they would not have time for you if you had a toothache, right? You'd have to wait 2 weeks or whatever before they got you in. We actually like dentists who are not completely efficient. And the same thing is true of organizations. We like organizations that are so good at what they do, they can be purposefully inefficient. They can have, playrooms for people to bring kids into. They can have pianos in the middle of their store instead of packing it full with garments like Nordstrom's does in the States, right? They have a piano player. Purposeful inefficiency. Okay. I'm going to give you 3 rules of business around this before we jump into some questions around strategic planning. Better before cheaper. What can we do to whatever it is that we do to make it better before we cut our price? Right? The default value on most people is to cut price. It's lazy. It's lazy. Cutting price is lazy. It's also demonstrably a really bad way to produce profit. The number one driver of profitability in any organization is price. And yet it's something that's hardly looked at. How can we maintain a high price level, right? Maintain our prices. Because if you think about it, every dollar of increased price yields a significant increase in profitability. Let me give you an example. Take 1% of your top line, take 1%, and add that number to your bottom line. That's called the 1% solution. That means if we could increase our prices, not do anything else in the organization, but increase our prices by 1%, that's how much additional profit we would have at the end. 1%. And pricing allows you to professional pricing allows you sometimes to do it by increase your prices by 5 or 10%. Okay, so better before cheaper, revenue before cost. What can we do to increase revenue before cutting costs? There's no company, no organization that has cut its way to prosperity. Never happened. In fact, at one point, Domino's Pizza in the States, they made a pizza so bad nobody would buy it because they cut their costs to nothing, right? They had the lowest costs in the industry, but they also had terrible pizza. So nobody cuts their way to prosperity in business. Can't happen. Now, you can do it temporarily to save the organization, but long term, not going to work. And then lastly, price before volume. How can you increase price? And I'm going to give you a 4th one here. People before process. That's not in the book. This is Ed's adding this. People before process. If you're going to be efficient, you can be efficient with process, but be effective with people. Does that make sense? Right? Effective with people. All right. This is more from Jules Goddard here, and what he says is that strategy is often the opposite of budgeting, yet oftentimes strategic planning is a lot about setting a budget for stuff, right? If you think about it, strategy looks at competition and it looks at our future potential, right? That's really what it's looking. That's in this quadrant, the future potential and what is the competition doing as well. Budgeting looks at the past and it's more planning, right? Again, what happened in the past. Dr. Goddard calls budgeting the rain dance process of business, right? We go through this process of rain dancing so we can predict what our costs are going to be in the future, not knowing anything. He says, but strategy, because budgeting is about managing what? The cost side, right? Whereas strategy is about managing the revenue. He says we should invert the number of accounts that we have that manage expenses versus those that manage revenue. We should have most of the accounts should be on the revenue at the top of the profit and loss station. We should analyze that. And then costs should just be one number at the bottom because it really doesn't matter. right? Even Peter Drucker said that inventing the term cost center was the worst mistake he made in his career. Right? He said, ultimately, business is about profit centers, not cost centers. He said, I should never have invented the word cost center. It was a mistake. Right? And the only profit center is a customer whose check doesn't bounce. So that's what we gotta find that out. Okay. Here's another quick, and we'll get to some questions in just after this, but this is another way of thinking about strategy. I really like this definition of strategy. How can we be better than the competition at what is important to customers? So the focus of the conversation around strategy is, what is it that we can do to be better than the competition at what is important to customers? And this is by Dr. Kenichi Omai, who's a McKinsey consultant out of Tokyo. And he says this. He says, we have to manage the differentiation between the company and the competition. So this differentiation, think about this as a yin and yang, right? It's a push and pull that we often see between these two things, right? So as we differentiate, what happens? This point in the triangle gets extended out. And you see, here's the needs. So this is the needs of understanding the customer. This is a very steep line. But if we differentiate ourselves, notice that the slope of the line decreases, and it becomes easier for us. So if we think about moving up the slope, it becomes easier for us. It's longer to get, but it's an easier slope for us to understand that. And he says, but keep in mind that as you differentiate, competition will copy you. So there's always a push and pull of differentiation. You always are in a process of differentiating yourself against the competition. You can't but not be, right? So that's always going to happen. You can't just do differentiation once and we'll say we'll be done with that. And then I'm going to share with you a couple of strategic planning tools. So now that we've answered the MOASC and understand, I think, from a strategy perspective, some basics, I'm going to start to share with you some planning tools. This is the oldest and most basic strategic planning tool. It's called a SWOT analysis. Everybody heard of SWOT analysis, right? Strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats. I'm pretty sure this cave painting in France was a SWOT. I mean, if you look at it, okay, so like we've got the bows and arrows, they're big and can run really fast, right? So I'm pretty sure that this is a SWOT analysis, right? So it's been around quite some time. I think one of the things that people miss on a SWOT analysis is presenting it in this format, right? That is understanding that strengths and weaknesses oppose one another, everybody gets. Opportunities and threats oppose one another, everybody gets. But you're also supposed to try to line up your strengths with your opportunities. And you're supposed to also try to line up your weaknesses with your threats so that you can overcome them. And I think that's what a lot of people miss. They just list out strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats. But what I found real power in this is that when you line these things up, especially over here in this strengths and opportunities, right? How can we take what are our strengths and put those things on the opportunities that we see and line those things up and concentrate our strategy on those areas, right? And I think that's one of the biggest insights that a SWOT analysis can give you. There's a problem with the SWOT analysis, though, in that all too often when I've done this with organizations, this is where the strategic plan gets created and then never executed, is at this level. Because people are like, okay, yes, we agree, this is our strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats, terrific, we're going to do this, but here's the problem. We got already jobs that we got to do on a daily basis. How do we do this strategy while we're doing our regular job, right? And that's one of the key problems with the SWOT analysis is that it makes no mention of, all right, what are we going to stop doing? So my suggestion to you, and also this tends to be top-down. In other words, this tends to be smart people in the company sitting in a room deciding what these things are and then disseminating it down to the rest of the organization. That's where it tends to happen. I prefer this second tool, which is called a Startstop Continue. Many of you probably heard of this. The reason why I like this is because it takes into account this stop, right? And this can be done bottom up. One of the exercises that I would do with a small organization is have everyone in the organization go through a list of things they want to start doing, things they personally want to stop doing, and things that they want to continue doing personally. What do they want to do personally? And have them think about that. And then what you can begin to do is then roll those things up inside the organization by group or department or whatever till you get to the top. And what's really interesting is that oftentimes you'll see groups of people and there's somebody who wants to start doing something that somebody else wants to stop. Awesome, right? Great. So we just got to figure out a plan to translate this. Instead of Fred doing it, now Anna's going to do it. Okay, terrific, right? So we can make those things happen, and then oftentimes, because somebody wants to start doing, they're more enthusiastic about it. So this start, stop, continue is, I think, is a better tool than the idea of the SWOT analysis. If you're going to use one of these, I prefer this one. And again, this one tends to be more bottom up versus top down, right? And you can bring this all the way on up to the top level, and then as an organization, we ask, what do we want to start doing, stop doing, and continue doing? And it's got that stop in there, right? So what are we not going to do? So we're feeding back into one of the things I said earlier. The strategy is about what are you not going to do. So this gives us the opportunity to do that. All right. This one's interesting. We've known this for years. This is a little syllogism. Right? We've known this for years. This was a study done by Xerox in the 60s. And what they've found is this, that colleague satisfaction, which is what we call them here at Sage, you might think of them as employees, colleague satisfaction yields customer satisfaction, and customer satisfaction yields financial performance. So this is the syllogism. So if we want to perform well financially, what do we look at? Well, we look at how happy our customers are. And if we want to improve our customer satisfaction, we look at how happy our people are. And one flows to the next to the next. We've known this for years, but we have a learning disability in business, modern business. We have a learning disability, all right? And that is that we only like this one. We only want to measure this one. This is the one we have lots and lots of data about, right? And what we like about this is we can be precise with this. We can be precise. This is more judgment, so we're like, yeah, that's soft, very soft. But I can be precise with this. Great, we can be precisely wrong. I'd rather be approximately correct than precisely wrong. And in looking at measures of customer satisfaction and colleague satisfaction, we can be approximately correct. And we can look at things that we can do inside the organization that will ultimately drive financial performance. But note that to improve financial performance, one doesn't consistently look at financial performance metrics, right? You don't lose weight. You don't go on a diet and lose weight by getting a more accurate scale, or by weighing yourself more frequently, right? That's not how you lose weight. Right? You make changes in your life in other places. And the same thing is true in organizations. We got to make changes outside of this area of financial performance, right? This doesn't happen but for that. Does this make sense, everybody? Right? So one causes the next. So colleague satisfaction causes customer satisfaction, and customer satisfaction causes financial performance. Right, this is supposedly proven. I'm actually not so sure. And I'll be quite frank about this. Because one of the things that has been further studied is, okay, what causes colleague satisfaction? And there's a tie that's been recently uncovered by a guy by the name of Phil Rosenzweig in a book called The Halo Effect, where he says, I think I've uncovered the source of colleague satisfaction. Anybody want to take a guess? Financial performance. People that work in organizations that perform well financially are often happier. Now we have what we call an Excel circular error. Right? So Xerox seemed to prove this in the past. I don't think it's necessarily the case. I do think that it is, in fact, a cycle, right? And the folks at Google are very happy because they have free lattes all day. I mean, that makes them very happy because they're performing financially very well. What I think is important, though, and why I wanted to share with this, okay, you just debunked your slide. Why did you bother doing that? Is because I think what's important is understanding that there needs to be balance. We're way too weighted on this side, right? We're way too weighted over here. We spend an inordinate amount of time worrying about financial performance, and I think not enough time understanding customer satisfaction and colleague satisfaction, and in fact even measuring it. Okay, here's some questions for those of you who want to do some strategic planning. How can this is an example of getting to that triangle. The triangle that I shared with you is how can we differentiate ourselves, right? So how can we educate our people better than our competition in both technical and people skill areas, so that they will be more valuable than their counterparts in other organizations? I really like this question, right? Because it's not just about, all right, what do we, learning is great, and everybody wants knowledge and growth in organizations, but this is very specific, right? That we need to educate people, and by the way, it's not train. I don't like train. Horses and dogs are trained. People are educated, right? There's actually a moral component to education, all education. And be at risk of being very crass here, but I can be known as the crass American, right? The simple example of this, and you will never think about this. This is very sticky, what I'm about to tell you. You'll never think of this the same way again. Do you want your 17-year-old daughter going to sex training or sex education? Right? Education, thank you. Because we need to educate. There's a moral component here. Right, so how can we educate them both in people skill and technical areas? How can we become more valuable to our customers by doing two things? Listening to them, and understanding their market. Right? It's not good enough to always understand our market. We have to understand the customer's marketplace as well. This is why specialization among accountants is important, because they can better understand a specific market that they serve. Right? It's specifically because of this. And then we need to apply those two things together. And then lastly, what three things will we change about our company's practices and policies to make it a better place to work? And so these are just some strategic planning questions that you can ask after you've asked and answered the MOASK, right? The MOASK, which is how do we create value outside the organization? That's step one. All right. If you want to measure colleague satisfaction, I'm going to share with you this. This would be my suggestion for you. You can get this out on the internet if you want to copy all of these down. But it's Marcus Buckingham's 12 statements. It's in his book, Now Go Work on Your Strengths, right? And what he says is this, is that on at least a quarterly basis, we should be asking everyone inside the organization their level of agreement with these 12 statements. And he uses a 6-point scale, 1 through 6. 6 being that, highly agree, 1 being highly disagree, right? He says these are the things that we need to know that are happening inside the organization, right? So just for example, in the last 7 days, I've received recognition or praise for doing good work, 1 through 6. Now what he says is after you do your first cut through this, the first thing you should do is go to the 2 highest scores and make them better, right? Make them better. In other words, don't do what the default value usually is, which is take the lowest ones and figure out a way to make them better. He says, figure out what this is on your 2 highest scores, go improve them. Why? Because that's why the people who are working for you currently are working for you currently. And if you want to solidify their loyalty to you and increase their satisfaction, increase what you're already good at first. Interesting way to think about it. By the way, he did correlate ultimately these questions to financial performance. And are you ready for the one that has the highest correlation ultimately to financial performance? I have a best friend at work. Really? Really? Yeah. High-performing organizations have people who are best friends at work. I know it sounds like, sit in a hot tub, sing Kumbaya, California crap, but that's what the studies are showing. That you got to encourage people to have a best friend at work. Not very hard. Meaning, it's a soft skill. Okay. So that was colleague satisfaction. This is, of course, my recommendation for measuring customer satisfaction, which is from Fred Reichheld's book, The Ultimate Question. It's been around for about 10 years. If you've taken a customer survey online, I'm sure you've seen the variation of this question. Reichheld says that this is the only question that you need to ask. Actually, two. You need to ask, why did they give you the score they gave you? Right? Says, but Reichheld's been writing books about customer loyalty and satisfaction for 30 years. And in his last book, he said, we used to ask 30 questions. It doesn't matter. This is the one. Right? So what is the likelihood that you would recommend our product, service, whatever, to a friend or colleague? That's what I want to know. Right? And he uses a 10-point scale. He says that this is highly predictive of financial performance. So think about that. As you see what he calls Net Promoter Score, NPS, go up 60 to 90 days from an increase in Net Promoter Score, you will see an increase to financial performance, whether that's revenue or profit, turnover, whatever, right? But it's actually predictive. And that's what we're looking for in business from an indicator perspective, right? Measurements that predict the future. So, here are my suggestions for measuring stuff inside an organization. I'm just going to suggest 3. The first is I just talked about, NPS, Net Promoter Score. Measure that. You can do a SurveyMonkey, 1,000 different tools to use to measure that. So measure Net Promoter Score. This next one is really interesting. HSDs. HSD is an acronym for High Satisfaction Day. Actually, I want you to create a system where you can measure, and every time somebody in your organization has a high satisfaction day, they should let you know. What is a high satisfaction day? Well, it's a high satisfaction day is a day on which you are highly satisfied. It's completely subjective, right? But it's why when you come to work and so it's different for everybody. Sometimes it's when someone closes a deal. Sometimes it's when they help a customer out of a difficult situation. People can have different HSDs for lots of reasons, right? You say, this is why I do what I do, and I have an HSD, and I want you to measure them. Again, this has been proven to be predictive of financial performance. That when HSDs in an organization rise, 60 to 90 days afterwards, we see increases to financial performance. So if we want to predict financial metrics, we don't look at other financial metrics. We actually look at other things like Net Promoter Score and HSDs. Here's the system for measuring HSDs. Ready? You need one person who's in charge of counting them. And anytime somebody has an HSD, they fire up an email, and in the subject line of the email, they type HSD and send it to that person. That's it. Done. Very sophisticated. Okay? Doesn't take much to implement. And then you count them weekly, monthly, whatever. And track. And again, the organizations that I've seen put this into practice are actually able to predict future financial performance at a much better rate than looking at any other financial metric. And then the last thing I'm going to suggest that you look at is what's called the value gap. This is really an interesting one. Value gap is simply this. Go to your Sage system, because I know you all use Sage. Go to your Sage system and pull up a list of all of your customers and some revenue number, whether it's lifetime or year to date or rolling 12 month, I don't care. Pick some discrete period of time, right? So you have your customers and then revenue in some form. And then pick about 10 of them, 10 of those customers, and have conversations with people inside the organization that said, okay, we charged this customer in the last 2 years 30,000 pounds. How much value did we create for them? And you go through a process of thinking through how it is that your organization specifically created value for this customer. And you're like, well, that's really hard. Yeah, it is. But and what I love about this metric is that it's the process of asking yourselves these questions that actually make the organization better at understanding how it creates value today, but more importantly, how it might create value in the future. So this is the precursor, in a way, of the mother of all strategic questions, which is how are we going to create value in the future, right? We first ask ourselves, how in the past have we created value? And I want you to try to get to a number. Be as specific as you possibly can. Like say, you know, we saved them 4 days worth of work on this, and we were able to decrease their costs here. We were able to increase their financial performance here, and this is how we created value. And hopefully, by the way, that number is higher than the revenue that you charged them. At least it should be. Right? That's really the target. You should be above and beyond that in some way. And you're like, really? That's it? He said, yeah. Right? Because this actually changes the thought process in the organization. Just going through this exercise of value gap on a regular basis inside the organization, whether it's monthly or quarterly, doesn't really matter to me, changes the thought process from one of usually focus on cost to focus on value creation. And this is really, I think, the beginning of long-term strategic planning. All right, so what are you going to do next? I've got 3 things for you. First, a warning, a caveat. If you're not going to commit to it, do nothing. If you're not really going to commit, do nothing. That's why this is like dieting. Okay? What's the best diet? The one that works for you. What's the worst diet? The one that you can't commit to. The one that you cheat on. Right? And I will say this. What makes organizations worse is when you go through a strategic planning process and nothing happens and nothing changes. It demoralizes people. So if you're not going to really fully commit to anything, just keep winging it. It's better. Honestly, just keep winging it. Much, much better. I approve of that strategy if you're not going to commit to something else. Okay? Next, research the strategic planning tools, and I gave you 3 of them today. Right? I gave you the SWOT analysis, which you probably already knew about, the Start, Stop, Continue, and I gave you that model, that syllogism model. Those are 3 strategic planning tools in case you missed that. All right? And there are others. I just presented 3 quick ones today. Research the ones that work for you and the one that you can commit to the best. Right? And lastly, here's the 3rd thing. Did I mention you need to commit to this? Did I mention that? Right? It's like 3 most important things in real estate: location, location, location. 3 most important things in strategic planning is commitment, commitment, commitment. Because it is demoralizing otherwise. If you like what you heard this morning, this is my quick commercial. I do a radio show that's available called The Soul of Enterprise. You can go to thesoulofenterprise.com. You can, ed.kless is my Twitter handle. And I've had, if you want to send me an email, ed.kless@sage.com, by the way, or just shoot me up on Twitter, hey, send this to me. I'll try to remember to tweet it with the Accountex hashtag. I did interview Dr. Jules Goddard for this show, who I mentioned earlier today, and fascinating interview. I'd be happy to send you that as a link as a follow-up to today. It's probably the best hour of strategic planning advice that I've ever encountered. All right, so thanks. This has been fun.